When I was a little kid, I used to watch WWF Saturday Night Main Event with my dad on television. I remember he would flip through the channels and we would catch it live when it was happening. And oh my gosh, I just loved the larger than life characters and personas that wrestlers portrayed back in these days. And as I got older, wrestling sort of got older with me. We went into the Attitude Era in the late 90s, and along with that era came a slew of amazing wrestling video games. And in this video, guys, I'm going to talk about my top 10 retro wrestling games. But first, a word about this video's sponsor, AG1. When you're a content creator on YouTube, your nights are usually spent editing videos.
Look at him hard at work, his mind thinking, his brain stinking.
I'm not gonna lie, it's draining. Luckily, AG1 sent me their product, and I'm already feeling the benefits. AG1 is a foundational nutrition supplement, and if you're like me, a guy in his 30s with a wife and kids, you're starting to realize how important it is to keep up with your health. I'm a guy who normally drinks energy drinks daily, and I hear that stuff is really not the best for you. AG1 gives me the energy I need throughout the day without the caffeine crash I get from coffee or energy drinks. I drink AG1 every morning. 1 scoop in 12 ounces of water does the job. AG1's antioxidants help support my metabolism and give me better mental clarity, alertness, and better focus. Many vitamins and minerals are hard for the body to process. AG1 makes it easy by carefully sourcing their ingredients for absorption, potency, and nutrient density, so you can get the most out of the nutrients you consume. The ingredients are accessible, available, and ready to do what they're capable of, so that you can get back to doing what you're capable of. And for me, that means making more My Retro Life videos. Go to drinkag1.com/myretrolife to get started on your order. AG1 is going to give my community a free 1-year supply of AG vitamin D3 plus K2 and 5 AG1 travel packs with your first purchase. Thanks to AG1 for sponsoring today's video. Coming in at number 10, it is WWF WrestleMania on the Nintendo Entertainment System. Man, I have a lot of nostalgia for this one. This was, in fact, the very first wrestling video game I ever played. My friends who live next door to me, Timmy, Tommy, and Toby, I've talked about them on the show before. When I was a little kid, they had this game, and I would go over to their house and play WrestleMania on the NES. It was the first time I'd ever really experienced any of these wrestlers or any kind of wrestling at all in video game format. And I got to know a lot of these characters and wrestlers through this video game. This is the oldest game on the list, came out in 1989, and it was developed by Rare. Way before their Donkey Kong Country days, they were developing really cool games on the NES, and this was one of them. Some people may not like the really goofy animations. I think the animations are what give this game its charm. I love the roster here too. It's so old school. You've got wrestlers like, of course, Hulk Hogan, who was the face of WWF at the time. But then you've got guys like Andre the Giant, who didn't really make it into many video games past this late 80s, early 90s era. So it's really cool to see him here. You got some guys like the Honky Tonk Man, who are also a part of that older generation. The controls here are kind of hard to figure out. For me, as a kid, I would always just play this and button mash and just hope for the best. It's a very simple game compared to a lot of the other wrestling games on this list, but hey, it has to make it on the list for me because this was my first wrestling game that I ever played in my life. At number 9, it's WWF Rage in the Cage. Developed by Sculptured Software and released in 1993. I got this game Christmas of 1993, that year. A CD quality wrestling game. And in that regard, the game does not disappoint. You actually do get some of those CD upgrades here with voiceover announcers. You actually got, Mean Gene. He's in there announcing every wrestler, and hey, that was so cool to see him in there and hear him.
From Atlanta, Georgia, weighing 265 pounds, the Narcissist, Lex Luger.
It was just a new frontier. Hearing CD quality audio coming out of a game. Back then, I guess we were so easily wowed, and this one really wowed me, guys. I love the roster that is here. There's a really unique roster that, honestly, some of these wrestlers did not make it into the other wrestling games developed by Sculptured Software. It's really cool to see wrestlers like the Nasty Boys or even Kamala in this game, because these are characters that really did not make it into any of the other games. The WWF wrestling games developed by Sculptured Software have this really addictive quality to them, guys. They're very accessible in that anybody who can just pick up a controller and button mash can kind of figure out how the game plays. Really, it's all about the grappling system in their games. Once you grapple an opponent, it's all about how fast you can hit one of the buttons on your gamepad. Each button on the controller represents a different move. And so this was a very easy pick up and play wrestling game. Now, what is sorely missing is the Royal Rumble matchup that was found in the previous entry, WWF Royal Rumble. And I really wish that was here. But the cage matches are a nice surprise. They are fun to play, and really, this was my introduction to cage matches. You know, back in those days, I would only catch the odd wrestling match on TV. I didn't watch it all the time, and so I had never seen a cage match before this game. Rage in a Cage actually introduced me to the whole match type. When you add together the addictive gameplay by Sculptured Software, the cool CD-ROM features that were exclusive to the Sega CD, and just a whole lot of nostalgia, that's why it's on the list. Coming in at number 8, it's WWF No Mercy on the Nintendo 64. Now, some of you are probably shaking your heads right now. You wrestling video game diehards are like, what is wrong with you? This is one of the greatest wrestling video games of all time. I understand that. But I personally don't have as much nostalgia or memories with this one as I do with some of the others on the list. Now, No Mercy is a game I did experience, though. I had rented it a few times when I was younger. In the year 2000, I was 14 years old and still very much a wrestling fan. No Mercy is so incredible for what it's doing on the Nintendo 64. As a late era release on the console, they are pulling all the stops here. The animations are second to none on the system. You've got really awesome wrestler entrances as they make the ring. And really, everything looks, sounds, and plays amazing in this game. Definitely one of the greatest assets to this game is its robust career mode. You go through a season as a wrestler, and you take on either the World Heavyweight Championship belt or the IC belt. This game gets it right. And I loved it when I was renting it back in the day. I had so many good memories with it. Has a great roster from the Attitude Era. You finally get wrestlers like The Rock and Rikishi. Aside from the career mode, you have a fantastic Create a Wrestler mode where you can create your own wrestler. And while this wasn't the very first Create a Wrestler that I ever experienced, it sure was one of the most extensive. It's a fantastic game that so many people love. So many wrestling fans put this at the top of their list. Because of that, I had to put it somewhere on the list. It's not my number one, but it definitely made an appearance. Coming in at number 7, it's WWF SmackDown on the PlayStation. Oh, guys, man, this is a good one right here. I was so addicted to SmackDown back in the day. I mean, this was the first WWE game developed by Ukes. They really hit a home run with just the first one. I love the gameplay, man. It's really fast. It's really easy to pick up. And it's different enough from what had come before it while refining all the great moments that you had in the AKI Corporation games. I actually love the way this game looks and plays. I think the graphics are amazing for what the PlayStation 1 is doing. It looks to me better than the games on the Nintendo 64. Like, it, to me, is one of the best looking PlayStation 1 games. I don't know, maybe I'm crazy in saying that. Let me know in the comments if you think the graphics look amazing on SmackDown, the very first one. I think it's doing a remarkable job for the time this came out on the PlayStation, pushing the system to its limits. And some of my favorite wrestlers are here and on display. You got the British Bulldog, you got Big Boss Man, of course, The Rock is here, Stone Cold Steve Austin. And man, I don't know, there's some guys here that, we're still kind of representing the old guard and the new era. And so it's just great to see them all come together here. Ken Shamrock's there. Oh man, great stuff. Great game. One of my favorites, honestly. And that's why it's on this list. Coming in at number 6, it's WCW NWO World Tour. This was the first Nintendo 64 wrestling game ever released. It came out in 1997, late 1997. Man, these THQ games, they were so good. And this was the first one I ever played, and it was so addictive. I mean, just getting to play multiplayer too was a huge deal. And this was the first time I could invite my friends over, 3 other friends, pick a wrestler, and just beat each other down. It was honestly one of the first 4-player fighting games I ever played, if not the first. Man, it made for tons of incredible multiplayer experiences. And WCW NWO World Tour, man, it was one of my favorites back in the day. It doesn't have, as many modes or as many features as some of the other games on this list, but man, I just loved it. And it was my introduction to Nintendo 64 wrestling games. And for what it did for me back then, the memories I have with it, gosh, I got to put it at this spot on the list. It's up here higher because of it. Coming in at number 5, it's WWF WrestleFest, an arcade exclusive released in 1991. This was the sequel to WWF Superstars, and guys, man, this is such a fantastic game. I mean, back in the day, you got to put yourself in my 5-year-old shoes, because I loved watching wrestling with my dad, like I mentioned before, Saturday night's main event, but there featured in many an arcade was WrestleFest, a game that just grabbed your attention from the get-go. As you walked up to this arcade unit, the attract mode would just bombard you with these incredible visuals, gigantic sprites, amazing color palette, and awesome cutscenes featuring Hawk and Animal. And once you put your quarter in and selected your wrestler, and if you picked, like I always picked, the Royal Rumble match, oh man, there was nothing like it, guys. To see all of those gigantic sprites on the screen, all of these visuals that just were impossible on home consoles. This looked like 32-bit graphics. This was like from the future back then. And there was such a gigantic difference. I'm going to throw it up on the screen right now between 8-bit wrestling games of the time and what you were getting in the arcades. I mean, if you were a gamer back then, this left such an amazing impression on you. And so for that reason, I have so much nostalgia for this. I love all of the animations the characters have. Definitely major arcade vibes, easy to pick up and play, very hard, but so much fun. And like I said, man, the Royal Rumble match, that's where it's at, guys. Like, that's the thing that I just loved coming back to for this game, was just putting in my quarter, selecting my wrestler, and just marveling at the amount of characters that were on that screen all at once. I was only 5 years old, and I was just like, oh my gosh, staring up at the screen, just being mind blown and mesmerized. So iconic. Love WrestleFest. At number 4 is WWE Raw 2 on the original Xbox. Emphasis on E there. This was the very first time I ever played one of these wrestling games where the shift had happened and WWF was now WWE. This one really stands out and is so high on this list, guys, because to me, it was so much better than the predecessor. WWF Raw on the Xbox kind of laid the groundwork, but it really was an imperfect game. And this really isn't a game that people put on their lists as their favorite wrestling game, but I just love this game for so many reasons. It, to me, had the greatest career mode I'd ever played in a game, in a wrestling game. And because of your ability to create a character or go through career mode as either your created character or an established character, and the season mode, going through the different pay-per-views and trying your best to win the championship, the World Heavyweight title or the Intercontinental belt, all the wrestling belts are represented here. And because of the kind of like cut scenes that would happen that showed you the storylines and the drama that was kind of happening between you and other wrestlers, the rivalries that could happen and the feuds, man, no other wrestling game I feel like had displayed that side of WWE in that way before. Like, I really felt like I was playing through the television show Raw. I logged so many hours into this game because of just how incredible that career mode was. And for that reason, it's way up on this list. Now, the graphics are another thing too, because man, at the time, I'd never seen a wrestling game that had this sort of incredible realistic graphics. I mean, it was the closest to what we were watching on television. And for the realism, for the way it controlled and the way it played and the way that season mode rolled out, that's why it's super high on this list. At number 3, it's WWF the arcade game by Midway. Oh man. And when I'm talking about this game, I'm talking about the arcade version. A lot of people don't remember that Midway, in the midst of their heyday with Mortal Kombat and NBA Jam, also put out this wrestling game. I mean, guys, when you're playing as Shawn Michaels and you're beating the heck out of Doink the Clown and giant hearts are coming out of you because you're the Heartbreak Kid, or when you're pulverizing somebody as the Undertaker and tombstones are flying out of your character, this is an arcade fighting game in disguise as a wrestling game. And I just love it. All the announcers, you got Jim Ross in there. This is like wrestling on steroids, and if it were like a Saturday morning cartoon or something. For that intense action that really only Midway could produce back then in those days in the arcades. This one is famous for its digitized graphics, which Midway was so good at producing back then. The wrestlers that appear in this game all had themselves photographed and recorded for digitization into the game, and it's just so cool to see them all here doing these crazy things and wild moves. I remember playing this game at the local community center where I first experienced Mortal Kombat. Yeah, years later, after they put Mortal Kombat into this community center, they eventually brought in NBA Jam and WrestleMania, the arcade game. It was another one of those games where when you first played it in the arcade, you were just blown away by what you were looking at. It was state of the art. It felt like you were playing a game from the future. And this game just brought so many smiles, so much fun, and that's why it's way up here on the list. At number 2, it's WWF Royal Rumble on the Sega Genesis. Now this one's so high up on the list because this is the first wrestling game that I ever played that made me love wrestling games. Now, I've mentioned Royal Rumble a couple of times on this list, and that's because Royal Rumble was my favorite pay-per-view. It was actually the pay-per-view that got me into being a hardcore wrestling fan. And so getting the game that featured the Royal Rumble matchup around this time, man, I would play the game, and then I would go back and watch my Royal Rumble VHS, and then I would feel I'd get in the mood to play the game again after watching the VHS and vice versa. And so the cycle went. And so, man, I just have so many amazing memories, just loving the gameplay here. This is another one of those games developed by Sculptree Software, and they just hit it out of the park with Royal Rumble. I think it's the best wrestling game that they released in this era, and it's really one of my favorite wrestling games of all time. Seeing all those characters come into the Royal Rumble matchup on my Sega Genesis 16-bit hardware, really having that game mode represent the Royal Rumble matchup so well with all the wrestlers, it was so cool. And it did remind me of the arcade game that I mentioned earlier, WrestleFest. It was like the closest we had gotten to recreating that feeling of the Royal Rumble match. And so I honestly, guys, would play the Royal Rumble match over and over again, and I would change my character. And I loved how randomized it was. You really didn't know. Like, even if your character got thrown out of the ring, it was fun to just watch and see who would end up winning the match. The game allows you to just continue watching the Royal Rumble match, and the CPU would take over at that point. And so there was like this highly addictive quality to it where I just kept playing it because it was all randomized and it felt like something new each time you played. It's very dated now compared to some of the other games, and some of you might be thinking, man, you're crazy for putting this so high on the list. But like I said earlier, the nostalgia is way too strong with this one, and that's why it's number 2. And at number 1, you may have guessed it because you didn't see it yet on the list, it's WCW NWO Revenge. I rented this game so many times from my local Blockbuster that they might as well have just given me the copy. It was one of those games that I would rent every time I would go to my mom's house on the weekends that she had me. This one was just better in every way. It was so much better than the predecessor, WCW NWO World Tour, which I talked about earlier on the list. This one just expanded the roster. The graphics and the textures looked so much better. The animations felt more fluid. The camera angles and just the way this game played, it was so addictive, guys. This one really started introducing more of the pay-per-view matches and the locations. Like, you could be doing Halloween Havoc pay-per-view and it would be represented with authenticity. I'll never forget the blood. I remember having my friends come over and just like saying to them, yeah, watch this, guys, and me taking the chair and just smacking them in the face and making them bleed with the chair. Oh my gosh, it was so... There was some sort of rush you got from seeing that sort of thing back in the day. I love the animations for the ref. Like, this little cartoon ref actually comes in and does the countdowns when you pin somebody. And there's just a lot of charm in that character. And I know there are other games that are better than this one, as far as most people would say No Mercy is better, or even WrestleMania 2000, but WCW Revenge just supplied so much fun for me back in the day. With my friends, I would have them come over. We'd have sleepovers at my mom's, and I'd rent the game, and we would play WCW Revenge for hours. There's a reason why this is considered one of the best wrestling games ever, and it's because it just plays so well. More often than not, if I'm going to play a wrestling game, I'm going to go back to Revenge. It's one of the best, and it's one of the best for a reason. Well, that's about it, guys. I really hope you enjoyed this video, taking a look back with me at some of my favorite retro wrestling games from back in the day. I love wrestling. It's just such a fun entertainment sport, and I still get such a kick out of looking back at some of the old matches. If this is your first time to the channel, please do consider subscribing. I love talking about my game crazy family and all the amazing adventures we had with video games, so many of which were caught on tape by my dad. That's it, guys. I'll catch you next time.